Mackerel is a midwater fish in the family Scombridae that lives mainly along coastlines or in the open ocean. Mackerel are found in temperate waters, and there are dozens of species classified as mackerel. They are typically round with a slender or torpedo-shaped body. They are also striped and luminous. Mackerel are carnivorous fish that travel in large schools and are known for their ability to dive at high speeds. They can live for more than 10 years in their natural habitat. The main type of mackerel we catch around Panama is the Sierra mackerel, also known as the Spanish mackerel. This is a relatively small inshore fish that typically weighs around 10 pounds. But don't let its size fool you, as mackerel can be quite aggressive and pull hard when they latch onto bait. We often catch mackerel near submerged rocks and around many of the islands in our area. Locals love to catch mackerel for food, but we usually catch them with swim bait when looking for roosterfish and cubera. Anchovies or sardines are good mackerel bait, and we usually catch them with slow-moving lures. These mackerel are attracted to shiny lures and floating baits. However, small poppers can also be effective. The waters around Panama are great for mackerel fishing, and the best time of year to catch them is from February to September. If you want to learn how to fish for Spanish mackerel, we can help. We offer Boca Chica, Panama fishing charters and VIP sport fishing packages to book your trip. Sierra mackerel are delicious when eaten fresh and go great with tacos and ceviche. But when you stay at our Panama Sport Fishing Lodge, you can let our professional chefs do the cooking, who know all the best ways to prepare mackerel. Mackerel are a very common fish in our waters. They taste great and are good bait fish. Here is a guide to different methods and ways to catch mackerel. Mackerel are a seasonal fish and usually arrive in our waters in late spring and leave in early autumn. But for the past 2 years, the mackerel have usually arrived in late September and stayed until January/February. People have been catching mackerel all winter, and I have personally seen schools of mackerel in January. They are easily found around piers, docks and jetties, which provide easy access to deep water and tidal currents which mackerel prefer. They tend to feed in the middle of the seabed. Pollock, mullet and mackerel all tend to hunt at roughly the same depth, top half. Few people know this, but when you unhook mackerel to put it back, please do not hold the sides of the hook to unhook it. All those scales on your hand or cloth are what the mackerel needs to control their temperature, and without those scales the mackerel will die within a day or two. You can either pull the hook out while it is still on the ground or try to hold the hook by the head and tail of the fish to unhook it. Mackerel usually hunt about halfway up from the seabed. Use this image as a rough guide to where the mackerel will be. It is helpful to try different depths to see what you can catch. If others are catching fish but you aren't, why not see where their stoppers are and how deep they are fishing? You will be catching around 1 to 2 pounds mackerel, so you don't need a heavy line, but the more feathers in the line the heavier your rod and reel will need to be. If you are fishing with 3 to 6 feathers, then attach around 15 pounds line to a fixed reel. I have used all sorts of rods for feathers, and I switch between using 3, 4, 5 or 6 feathers depending on how well the rod and reel can hold the fish on the feathers. I start out with a 9 feet spinning rod with 2 to 3 feathers on a fairly light reel. When I know the mackerel are close, I will switch to a heavier rod and reel and attach 5 or more feathers to it. I only need to use the heavier gear a few times before I have enough bait and dinner for the family that night. The reason I do this is because I find my hands get sore quickly when I use heavier gear. If I know I will be on the move for a while, I will use the lighter gear first, allowing me to move for as long as I need to. When I know they are coming, I will switch if needed or just use a few pieces of gear at a time. If you have never used floats before, you need to check out my float fishing setup guide. Mackerel are generally at the same depth, from 8 feet to 20 feet. They also tend to stay quite close to the cliffs and walls. If you are fishing from a pier, you probably only need to cast about 5 to 30 yards. I often see people on the pier casting as far as they can, but the mackerel tend to stick closer to the pier and cliff. The best places to catch mackerel are piers and rocks, both of which are in deeper water. Mackerel don't usually come too close to the beach. This doesn't mean they don't come, but as a general rule you will have much better results if you fish away from the beach. The best bait is something shiny. The most popular bait used for mackerel is the mackerel itself. Mackerel strips are great bait. You may also want to check out my preparing bait for mackerel guide in the beginner's guide section. Other baits used include grouper, mackerel, sand eel and squid. When mackerel strike the bait on the float, it will usually be very hard and fast. Your float will sink quickly, and most people will strike when the float sinks quickly. If the float just sinks a little and then comes back up, I would wait a little to see what happens. circle hooks for catching mackerel. Because of the design, this type of hook is much harder for the fish to escape than other types. I use circle hooks every time I fish and have much better results. The most common method of catching mackerel in the UK is feather fishing. This involves throwing out a string of hooks with weights on the end, usually using a fairly heavy rod. This is essentially the same method that sustainable commercial vessels use to catch mackerel, except that they use 100 hooks per line. All you have to do is take the mackerel feathers out of the packet and attach a 3 ounces lead weight to the end, depending on the weight of your rod, which will be written on it. Then throw out the feathers and reel them in. If you are fishing in shallow water, you may need to retrieve them quickly to avoid snagging on the bottom. Hopefully you are fishing in a harbor with deep water, as these are usually the best and often have clean, easy to fish ground. When using the recommended tackle below, the weight used should match the casting weight of the rod to avoid breakage. Also, I highly recommend replacing the line that comes with the reel. 2 ounces lead lines are handy if you don't know how much strength is on the reel, as they will take some of the strain off your line. This setup is cheap and works for summer mackerel, but not for much else. If you're looking for something more serious to catch mackerel with for years to come, you might like our guide to the best mackerel rods, where we highlight a range of feather rods. On these rods, you tie a single spinner to the end of your line. These rods are light, so you'll have more fun catching smaller fish than you would with feather rods. This is a more sporting approach, but it's just as effective as feather rods and gives you more options in terms of what you can catch. A 50 to 60 grams rod is light enough to allow a large mackerel to bend the rod properly. It won't break if you tie a 50 grams Dexter wedge, unlike some lighter rods. Here are some affordable rods that are great for mackerel fishing with a variety of lures and spinners. On a 9 feet spinning rod, you'll need a 4000 to 4500 reel from Penn, Shimano or Daiwa if you want something reliable. The Ninja and the new Legal Eyes are 2 exceptional options this year, both of which we tested. If you're using regular monofilament, the clear kind, a 4000 reel will be wide enough to prevent the line from winding. 12 pounds monofilament is strong enough to handle lures up to 40 grams, as long as your drag is set for larger fish. If you are using braid, you can use a 3000 gauge reel, which will make the set lighter and allow you to cast much further. However, with braid, you have to use a leader, which requires the ability to tie the braid to a fluoro leader knot. If you are unsure of what size reel to buy, a rod and reel set is the simplest. Float fishing, which involves suspending a mackerel bait under a float supported by a small weight. Float fishing is the most relaxing way to fish, and it is fun to watch a float disappear. It is also good with children who are not yet able to cast. The best approach to float fishing is to use a rod longer than 10 feet, so that you can easily lift the line. This will prevent the fish from escaping easily. Second, you should adjust your depth frequently if you are not catching fish, until you know how deep the fish are. Finally, using a 1-0 hook with a white mackerel, squid or anchovy belly as bait is a good idea. You want the hook point to be exposed and facing the bottom of the bait so that the fish cannot bite without hooking. In June and July, the huge spawning schools of mackerel split into smaller schools, moving up into the shallows around the British coast. They feed like teenagers on herring, sprats, eels and anything else they can find to bite. After the spring rush has passed, the mackerel remain on the coast until autumn and beyond. I caught one on Christmas Eve 2021 in Cornwall. You can catch mackerel in winter, and the biggest fish are usually caught then. It is easy to catch mackerel in December in the south some years. However, the best time to catch mackerel is early summer. Mackerel feed all day from dawn to dusk, but like many species, they are most active in the early morning and in the hours before dusk. They are visual feeders and you are unlikely to see them at night. Maybe they are hungry in the morning after a night without food, and by evening they are eager to get their last bite before dark. Who knows? It is possible that the bright sunlight makes the mackerel more cautious, as they are more visible to birds and other predators. High tides are best for mackerel, especially high tides in spring. Your chances of catching mackerel are much higher if you fish in the 2 hours before and after the high tide. If you fish on the ebb tide from many of the piers or jetties, your chances are slim. Mackerel usually follow the tide as the tide rises. Often at my local harbor you will see commercial boats about 100 meters offshore fishing for mackerel about 2 to 3 hours before the high tide, then in the 2 hours before the high tide we will start fishing from the harbor. Fishing for mackerel on the ebb tide can be good, but your chances are much lower. Go to BBC Tides, check what the tides are and aim to fish the 2 o'clock high tide and then the 2 o'clock low tide. Spring tides are when the tide rises higher than normal, then falls further than normal. They have nothing to do with spring. You can see these on BBC tides as the high tide is higher than normal and the low tide is lower than normal. Spinning mackerel with a spinner is the best way to catch large numbers of mackerel. A spinner or lure is an artificial fish that imitates fish. The original mackerel bait for fishing in the UK was a mackerel spinner, which was originally made from chicken feathers. Mackerel spend their lives chasing and eating small bait fish. When they see something that looks like a fish, they will eat it.